about 100 years ago, according to some records, roughly one in every three men in North America belonged to some sort of a fraternity, whether it was Freemasons or something else. And a lot of these organizations have declined over the centuries, so they're not really anywhere near as strong as they used to be. But now you have the rise of the personal growth movement in the last 4 or 5 decades, which is featured prominently in the area of interpersonal communication and connecting. And amongst all that has seen the need for the respective genders to be comfortable with each other within their own gender has also been part of it. So you have men's groups and women's groups forming. And the Warriors Weekend is just a further zeroing in on, let's say, or focusing on the essential lesson that all men face in their life at some point or another, which is examining the nature of their relationships with other men, and by extension, the nature of their relationship with their own masculine core, which means many different things, but essentially boils down to a sense of comfort with one's own gender. And we're often asked why we use these terms like Warrior Weekend, Samurai Brotherhood, squads, captains, lieutenants, division commanders, and so forth, which are all very militant or military-oriented terms. And they were chosen for a very specific reason, which is because we're facing a time in our culture, in our society, especially in the area of that we inhabit in so-called first world, where many men have softened to an extent that their masculinity has been, say, compromised in some ways, right? And that shows up in a lot of ways in their life through weakness in work, weakness in relationship, weakness in self-maintenance, weakness in overarching philosophies in life in terms of how they feel about themselves. And so, I've talked about this many times. What typically happens with men, most men, is when they feel that sense of dysfunction in their lives, they often turn to the feminine for solace, for consolation. What they sort of have to do is turn more back to their own gender as a way to recharge their batteries and strengthen themselves internally, and by extension heal unfinished business with the father or with elder males in their family system. And this in turn makes them stronger in the rest of their lives when they do this, right? So that's the overarching purpose of the Warriors Weekend, is for men to connect with each other, stay in relationship with each other, to take a look at the ways in which they alienate themselves from other men, and by extension feel alienated in the rest of their lives as well. Well, there's the traditional themes that always crop up in men's lives, which is, commitment versus loss of freedom. So one thing we talk about a lot, in this work, is there are different forms of freedom, right? So the masculine essence is often associated with the ideas around freedom and the importance of a man being able to choose a sense of direction in life, which is true to a large extent, but there are different forms of freedom. So there's the freedom that comes from, say, not having any practical obligations in your life, being a so-called free spirit, right? But then there's a different kind of freedom that comes from commitment. So, for example, when a man is committed in his life, whether it's just to his business or to his partner, he attains a freedom of mind, because his mind is not drifting off into fantasies and unfulfilled desires about what he doesn't have in his life right now. So it's a bit of a paradox. You might think a guy who doesn't have, let's say, relationships, or a primary relationship, is more free, technically speaking. It looks to be that way superficially, but he's not necessarily more free in a state of mind, because his mind is going to be filled with thoughts of when is his next partner going to arrive, when is his real life going to arrive. So he's sort of like a bit of a slave to his imagination, right? His unfulfilled desires, cravings, right? As the Buddha said, that the one thing that stops us from enlightenment is tanha, which is a Pali word that means craving, or wanting something that is not here right now, right? So a person who doesn't have a lot of external obligations has lots of space in his mind to dream about what he doesn't have. So that's a type of illusory freedom, you could say. And then there's a different freedom that comes from commitment, as I was saying, because your mind is not so occupied, right? The partner's there, right? Or the business is there, things are up and running. And so there's not so much time spent in idle dreaming about what is not, right? And so part of the men's work is also a kind of a training ground in understanding the power of commitment, whether it's not necessarily commitment to a primary partner, because that shows up differently for each person organically. But there are always things that can be committed to in one's life. The next thing you have to do, the next problem you have to solve, the next element in your career that you have to tackle and face into. And so commitment is a huge part of masculine development, let's say. Right? Well, I mean, the essential thing that has gotten out of the weekend is precisely that, the different forms of commitment through relationship, right? So back in the old Sterling organization that I trained in back in the early 90s, one of the maxims that we always looked at was that questions like a Zen koan: are you in relationship, staying in relationship, right? Or are you disconnecting, right? So in a weekend, men get to look at the ways in which they disconnect all the time from men. And even in a Zoom weekend, it doesn't really change. It's the same thing. Because whether you're sitting in a room in 3 dimensions with a bunch of bodies, or whether you're looking at a screen connecting electronically, you're still connecting mentally one way or another, or not connecting, as the case may be. So part of the value of the weekend is for the guy to see his own internal strategies in terms of how he disconnects from other men, or what sort of thoughts he's having about other men. You remember the weekend we had when there was a guy there, who talked about how he was ranking everyone in the room, right? And this was one of the funnier moments we ever had because he was so transparent with his judgments of what was going on for him, right? So this is another thing that happens. The man gets to see the ways in which he not just disconnects from other men, but the way he ranks himself, versus other men. And where he situates himself in the greater sense of the community of men, and his feelings around authority and authority figures, his sense of safety with men in terms of can he speak his truth about something or not, right? But in general, all he has to do is put himself in the soup, in the environment of being in the energy of that many men, which in our last one was 88 guys we had. And he's going to feel something. Stuff is going to come up. A lot of it which is coming from the unconscious mind. So he's not even necessarily aware that he had this stuff, right, inside of him until he puts himself in that situation. And our goal with men is always the same. We touch on this in the weekend, but it really gets looked at in the squads and the ongoing meetings, right? And the goal is reaching a place where you can be in the company of other men in a state of comfort. And there are, some technical terms for this, one of which, from the Sanskrit tradition, this term satsang, which means association with truth, sitting in the presence of truth. Now that is in a more spiritual, non-gender-based sort of context, but in men's work it's very similar in the sense of can you be in the presence of other men and be comfortable simply in that presence. Like one of the definitions we have of a good friendship is that you can be in silence with that person in a state of comfort. So if you can spend 5 minutes, 10 minutes walking on the beach with a friend, and neither side has said anything, and you're feeling comfortable, that's a sign of a deep connection, right? Because usually we fill up the space with words to cover up our anxiety or what have you. In men's work, it happens like that in the very specific context of being just with other men, right? So any unfinished business that a guy has with brothers, with his father, with any history in his family system relating to how men were regarded, and his self-image as a man tends to get provoked once he's in the presence of other men for no other purpose than waking up, right? Because men are so used to getting together, centering their purpose for getting together around an object. They're there to talk about something or talk about business or sports or a person or a woman or a man or what have you, and they're not talking about the one thing that they need to look at, which is their presence with each other. Right? That's the one thing that gets ignored. So in men's work, that's the one thing that is addressed, right? Is simple presence with each other. So So there's something called generational anger and generational guilt. So generational anger is when a current generation starts expressing or getting in touch with all the unexpressed anger of their ancestors, right? So in the case of, say, the Me Too movement, many women starting to feel the sense of social injustices, right? And oppression, which they've been subject to for so many centuries. But it was their ancestors that were more living it. Like 100 years ago, women didn't have the vote, right? So this is all such a recent shift that's been happening. Meanwhile, what's happening to men in all of that? Men are sort of accessing generational guilt and shame, which is facing the reality of all the things that their ancestors did, forefathers and so forth, that were maybe immoral or unethical or what have you. And so people are kind of swimming in these generational feelings without really understanding them that well, because in large part it isn't them, it's something that they've inherited, right? That's not to say that it can't be them right now. You can have a man who experiences guilt because he does need to look in the mirror and correct something ethically in his life, or a woman who's experiencing anger because she really is angry about something and needs to tell herself the truth about her anger, and so on. But there's also this historical influence which is very strong. And so many men are in that position, just speaking about men right now, that are in that position of feeling just uneasy about who they are and what they feel and what they think in their lives. And typically men have processed shame by being secretive, right? That's another thing that men's work addresses and aims to reverse, which is this secretive sort of patterning that men have of containing their shame and guilt inside themselves and then having that affect their lives in all kinds of negative ways. Because most men fucking well need it, right? And they need something like this because they need to feel some fire in their life. They need to feel alive, to get out of their heads, to feel connected with other men, to begin reevaluating their relationships with men, to take a good look at their relationship with their father, to feel in their bodies. And even if it is a Zoom weekend, it might seem counterintuitive. How could you feel in your body connecting over a flat screen? You absolutely can, because this is about a mental connection. It's about psychic energy, so to speak, at the level of the psyche of the mind, which of course includes the body. But it's all about your direct communication, sitting in the presence that we talked about before, the field of energy of connection with other men, and allowing all the unfinished business that is part of a man's personal history to come up to the surface, so that he looks square into the resistance that he has of opening up to other men and spending time with other men. That will positively impact his whole life when he does that.